Chapter 20, The Big Comeback. Word travels at Mach speed when you're doing bad. It wasn't at Martin Luther King Hospital, or MLK as we sometimes called it, for 10 minutes before people I knew started showing up in droves. MLK had never before received so much attention for a patient. There were countless calls tying up the lines and numerous visitors, mainly Crips and Criplets, packing visible weapons and demanding tight security. Drifting in and out of consciousness, I saw Bessie standing beside the gurney with tears in her eyes. Sally, between sniffles, kept saying, "Tookie, I asked you to be careful. Why didn't you listen?" I remember being annoyed and telling her to shut up before I passed out. The following day, I awakened with a serious headache, excruciating pain, and a cast on each leg. Seated in a chair across from the bed was Godfather, grinning and eating from the hospital food tray, while Criplet Deborah stood with her hands on her hips, dressed in super tight khaki pants, nearly too tight to hold her shapely basketball-sized derriere. When Godfather launched into a strategic dialogue about retaliation, I waved him off and told him to save that for later on. He said, "Alright, just kick back, cuz. Here's your Derringer and a box of shells." Then, indicating Deborah, he said, "Oh, by the way, I also brought you some stank." Deborah fired a few expletives, ending with, "And your mammy too." Godfather mentioned something about going to go quiet the crowd before the cops showed up. He suggested that Deborah and I use some privacy and quipped, "If she can't soothe the pain, nothing will." Deborah rolled her eyes, gave him the finger, then wantonly smiled at me. I had no intentions of doing anything. My mind may have been strong, but the flesh was extremely weak. I couldn't resist the primal urge. Later that evening, when the nurse re-entered the room, she was shocked to see Deborah lying beside me, partly nude. She politely scolded me, "Mr. Williams, you're not allowed to have a woman in bed with you. This is a hospital, not a motel." It didn't matter what the nurse said. My concern was the painkiller medication. I looked forward to the next shot like a junkie in need of a fix. My discomfort could not be alleviated by sex, banter, or getting loaded. I needed a powerful sedative to knock me smooth out. Early the next morning, I felt someone rubbing my bald head and heard people laughing. Jackie was peering down at me. "He's alive, folks," he said. Raymond was there and interrupted. "I see the man, but what are we going to do about this?" Both of them wanted to know who shot me, but I didn't know. Godfather speculated it was probably the Pyrus trying to make a name for themselves. Raymond said, "Well, it doesn't matter who the idiots were, they have to pay." At the moment, my least concern was payback, but it felt good to see camaraderie and hear them fussing over the next course of action. Being in a debilitated state didn't tarnish who I was. The supreme sacrifice for representing Crippism, martyrdom, retaliation, or shedding one's blood, even from the gutter level of existence, and detested as the scum of the earth. I sought approval and respect from my peers, no different than anyone else. But being bedridden and aching, there wasn't too much I sought other than relief. Jackie tried to cheer me up, but I wasn't in the mood. Raymond started going down memory lane, reminding me about the time when he tried to shoot a double-barrel shotgun with one hand and it almost knocked his shoulder out of socket. Though it was a hilarious moment, I heard too much to laugh, so I just nodded. He asked did I remember the time when a gang of us were strolling down the street and he kicked Melvin in the butt so hard he jumped in the air. The kick was so hard that our homeboys Warlock and Stephen G wheeled around to see what that sound was. Raymond went on to explain that he didn't like Melvin because he reminded him of the other so-called commanders of Crip factions, which wasn't supposed to happen. He chuckled and said, "Melvin's the same guy who wanted our alliance to be the Snoopies." What surprised me was that trigger-happy Melvin didn't shoot Raymond. I agreed with him, but it was too late to change the course of history. Raymond and I were more alike than we cared to admit. Both of us were defiant, aggressive, tactful, quick-tempered, and egotistic. To hear him rail against the attack on me and advocate payback really felt good, especially since we were at odds on the touchy subject of shared rule. The slight discord was based on my self-promotion and the assumption that I had a motive to be numero uno over the West Side Crips, the East Side Crips, and the Compton Crips. This was absurd. It didn't matter what the incompatibility was. the Crip agenda outweighed the trivial differences. Though there were rumors about Raymond plotting to smoke me, abandon Crip, and start a rival game, I didn't believe it. Our behavior in the hospital room showed our willingness to rise above such foolishness and above Shirley's attempt to manipulate a rift. Being cooped up in the hospital, I couldn't escape its sanitized odor that failed to camouflage the presence of sickness, disease, bloody wounds, and death. While there, I didn't reflect upon my own mortality, but I thought about Buddha, Robin, Craig, Didi, Odie, Diver Dan, Pretty Skip, Bebo, Big Boo, Kane, and the other Crips who had been killed. I remember Mr. X telling me about Salty, a Compton Crip I knew who was ambushed and killed. His last words were, "Don't let them forget me, Salty, a do-or-die Compton Crip." I pondered whether Crippin was worth all the deaths, suffering, or the tears. The trauma of the shooting was not a defining moment for me, more like an acknowledgement of being able to take a bullet and keep on stepping. But the problem was that I wasn't up and walking. When a group of doctors entered the room with medical charts, they exchanged ideas and opinions about my situation as if I wasn't present. I gathered from their medical jargon that the bones in both feet and ankles were shattered, and a calf was fractured by 45 caliber bullets. Their consensus was that I would never walk again. The thought of never being able to walk was terrifying. I pleaded with God not to let this be my cross to bear. I didn't want to be like Kool-Aid or Too Sweet, trying to crip from a wheelchair. I snapped out of my self-pity when I saw my mother enter the room with a mingled expression of grief and horror. There is nothing like a mother's comforting presence in a time of need. While she sat there in a dignified fashion, I felt awkward trying to explain what had happened. As she prayed over me, I dozed off. That way, I didn't have to explain myself. When I awoke, my mother was gone, and there was a new nurse in the room cleaning up. After cleaning the table stand, she opened the drawer and spotted the gun and a box of bullets. She closed the drawer, played it off as if nothing happened, continued to clean the room, and then left. Not taking any chances, I placed the tiny arsenal under the pillow. I was about to enter La La Land when security guards burst into the room, demanding to know where the gun was. Two of them started searching the room, while one guard looked inside the table drawer, then underneath the pillow. With the discovery of the gun, they stood around the bed, giving me the third degree. "What did you need the gun for? Who are you? Are you a Black Panther or something? Why are there so many people concerned about you?" Then the cops entered the room with some questions of their own. "Who shot you, Tookie? How many shooters were there?" Even if I knew their names, height, weight, and phone numbers, I would not have uttered a word. That was the gang hood code. Later, I was told by a nurse that for the safety of the hospital and other patients, I had to be moved from the premises in the morning. The nurse told me this was the first time a patient had ever been kicked out of a hospital. She asked, "Mr. Williams, are you some kind of gangster?" I told her I was too broke to be a gangster. The next day, Fred Shaw's son and another counselor, Kenny, picked me up in a van. Being wheeled out, I tried to retrieve my gun, but a sheriff informed me if I wanted the gun, I'd have to come down to the station, if I wanted it bad enough. I cursed as I wheeled past a crowd of Crips and Criplets into a waiting room. The cop yelled, "We got your gun, Tookie. Come and get it." The van pulled up in front of Shaw's office, across the street from the Red House, and I was carried in and placed on the couch. While I was resting, Bonnie appeared, staring down at me with tears in her eyes. She asked what had happened and where was Shaw planning to take me. I was too tired to answer any questions, so I waved her off. It was Shaw's intent to find me a Shangri-La type setting where I could face into anonymity. The house turned out to be located in Pasadena where two women, sisters, planned to look after me. I was placed in a bedroom with a well-lit bathroom. Next to the bed was a walker and a small table with a bowl of fruit, cups, and a pitcher of orange juice. Without any communication between me and the two females, it became evident that if I wanted to use the bathroom, I'd have to travel back and forth on my own. There were no bedpans and no one around strong enough to assist me. Somehow, I'd have to call forth whatever strength wasn't drained from my body to make the bathroom trip. It was less than 10 feet away, but it was like a walking mile. Due to soreness, I had lain in bed for days, unable to get and relieve myself. Finally, when I couldn't take it any longer, I managed to maneuver my legs to the side of the bed. It was physically impossible for me to stand up, so the only option was to crawl, and crawl I did. The entire process took from 30 minutes to an hour, depending upon how many rest periods I needed. With each grueling step, I cursed the maggots who put me in this condition. It burned me up knowing that I'd probably never get my hands on the perpetrators, especially since no one was eager to lay claim. If I was serious about a comeback, I'd have to do it on my own. After several weeks, I was able to use the walker, though it felt like hundreds of daggers were poking my legs and feet. To go back and forth to the bathroom left me weak and drenched with sweat. During my hospital stay, I didn't eat, but I drank a concoction of high-protein ice cream, baby Similac cherries, and condensed milk mixed in a blender. Drinking 2 or 3 glasses of this each day, I could feel my strength slowly returning. When the 2 sisters got wind of who I was, they were scared to death and wanted me to leave. I was booted back to the Slater Boys Home in Compton. From what the elder Shaw, the director of all the boys' homes, told me, a young Crip from the Red House had shot at Jamel. Jamel got into scrapes with other Crips, most often over a female. Either they took pot shots at him or they wanted to go one-on-one. Jamel was alright, he was becoming a close homeboy of mine, but he was misunderstood by most Crips. There were times when I had to step in to prevent a serious casualty, like when Godfather, Mad Bull, and Terrible T were plotting to smoke Jamel. Ambushing was their specialty, and they were more eager to follow through. But I wasn't interested in any madness. All I wanted was rest, and the Slater Boys' Home provided a peaceful habitat where I could convalesce. My physical rehabilitation had me returning to Martin Luther King Hospital, provided I agreed to enter from the side back door with just one person, Shaw Jr., no guns, and leave immediately after each session. The doctors had said I'd never walk again. My legs were as skinny as toothpicks and very weak, but they were able to hold up my weight. I used the walker for a while, then graduated to a wooden cane, like the ones we used to crack people over the head with. Talk about karma. The doctor made the decision to leave the bullets in my feet. To remove them would cause more damage. He told me that over the years, each bullet would make its way back to the surface, to the entry point. On the final day of rehabilitation, the doctor warned me that I'd have a permanent limp. I refused to believe him. Doctors had been wrong before. In the midst of all the prognostications, no one bothered to address the lingering trauma of being shot. The realization that I was not invincible, knowing I was vulnerable, was a rude awakening. I didn't feel comfortable unless Godfather, Jackie, LC, or others were found for security. For the time being, my flamboyance and boldness had been shattered like glass. I was very leery about strange noises and tentative about my movements outside the house. Everywhere I went, either Godfather or Jackie was there to drive me. We were armed as if we were going to war. Godfather's constant bragging about the retaliations that had taken place in my absence and future paybacks didn't restore my confidence the least bit. My nerves were so rattled that just hearing the sound of a gunshot, I'd almost jump out of my skin. There was a moment at Bonnie's mother's house while I was visiting my son Trevon that I heard a volley of gunshots. Though in cast, I managed to dive to the floor with a quickness that stunned even Bonnie. Somehow, I had to regroup and learn again how to cope with the madness out in the gangmanhood. There was no time for self-pity. My rivals would have no problems trying to finish their bungled job, especially since I was immobilized. I needed my size, strength, and ability to walk if I wanted to aggressively confront the opposition. With the discipline of a celebrated African distance runner, I underwent a strict regimen of workouts that forced me to grow into a massive rage. Never before had I possessed such one-pointedness. I was motivated, dedicated, and more than enthused to retaliate. During my recovery phase, there were Criplets like Crip Connie, Tasha, Tina, Goldie, Shelly from Long Beach, and the East Side's Little Pam, who were in and out of the Slater house. The most consistent was Little Pam. Crips chased after her like hounds in heat. Pam had no qualms about packing a gun or using it. She reminded me of Bad Bessie. I knew my back was covered with her around. She was more than a pretty face. We would stay in one another's life for a while, drift apart, then from time to time hook back up for a day or two. It felt good to have Pam and the other Criplets around to extend their time, attention, and assistance. But in spite of their feminine tenderness and the attempts to be Florence Nightingale, they were just as calculating and cold-blooded as I were. Had they been born male, they would have gained street reps equal or greater than those of some Crips. I respected the Criplets to the best of my limited male Crip nature, but they were still an enigma to me, as were all other women. As the months passed, my legs became stronger, but I still limped badly and wasn't able to run or even walk fast. What I lacked in foot speed and agility, I made up for in physical strength. From time to time, I would drive iron with a close homeboy, Marcellus, one of the spearheads of the Lantana Crips. We found common ground on the way pile and in knocking our opponents senseless at parties with every opportunity. Other than cripping, driving iron was the pinnacle of Cripdom. It was rare to find a Crip who wasn't into driving iron or didn't try to become yoked. Being able to work out seemed to get my life back on track, but I felt that time was running out for me. Bob Simmons knew several people who tried in vain to convince me to participate in their youth programs. A black man named Fred Horn had an idea about creating a program for individuals and gangs to promote peace. This eventually became known as the Round Table. I didn't participate because I wasn't interested, not to mention that Bob felt the guy was questionable. Another black man whose name escapes me was the director of the Uhuru Center on the west side. We had an idea for a program, but I waved it off too. Then Bessie, who warned me about the Alpha List, wanted to introduce me to another man interested in establishing a youth program. Godfather and I arrived at Bessie's apartment in the Avalon Gardens, where I shook hands with a tall, burly figure I didn't recognize. His name was Rosie Greer, an ex-football player. I'd never heard of him. I sat in silence listening to his plans to make the community better and safer, but it just didn't jibe with me. I wondered what this fat guy's angle was. He appeared from nowhere with this grand idea in his mind that missed my interest by 1,000 miles. Whether Rosie's intent was legitimate or not, his agenda clashed with my ideas of revolting against other street gangs and against the status quo, of which he obviously was a member. My rejection of outside help was indicative of the juices of rage flowing through my veins. There was nothing Rosie could have said to incite me to alter the only lifestyle I knew. Crip defined who I was. I didn't need a cane, blue rag, or a tattoo to confirm it. My name spoke for itself, and everybody knew what I represented. I was the Crips figurehead and politician rolled into one, and I was recuperating in record time.